Hi, this is Adam Feinberg from Harlem Stories. I'm, broadcasting alone today. My co-host Mark Becker is unfortunately unable to join us today, but hopefully I can give you some interesting material just by myself. Do love the banter that we have with Mark, so but hopefully I can still make this as interesting as possible for you. Harlem Stories, we're now broadcasting and releasing episodes bi-weekly. Always want to give you great content, and ultimately I'd rather give you better content less frequently than lousier content more frequently. So going forward, every 2 weeks we'll have drop a new episode. Today what we're going to discuss is the stories of the Audubon Historic District. And if you're not familiar, and a lot of people, might be familiar with John James Audubon and the naturalist. Most people think of, he's the bird guy, the Audubon Society. Well, ultimately that was created by as a result or named after for John James Audubon. Well, he lived in the southern portion of Washington Heights, and ultimately the neighborhood, the historic district, is now named after him. So what we're talking about is the section of Southwest Washington Heights. It is now an official historic district called the Audubon Park Historic District. It was land that was purchased by John James Audubon. He purchased a total of about 14 acres of land, and he built a large mansion along the Hudson River shortly after he published his now famous book, Birds of America. John died in 1851, and the surviving family sold the land in small portions throughout the 1850s and 1860s. In 1892, the city prohibited new wood frame construction, and the first masonry structures began to appear in Audubon Park were a row of 12 three-story townhouses constructed in 1896 on West 158th Street. So if you're coming off the West Side Highway and you're going, to the east, and you exit off at the 158th Street exit, off the highway, and you just go east, off of the exit ramp, you're going to pass these 13 row houses. I'm sorry, 12 row houses. My mistake. And as you're going up the hill, that's where you'll see them. And so these row houses have been a target for redevelopment as well as historic preservation in recent years. It's worth mentioning. I know there's an effort still alive and kicking, in trying to, turn these into, preservation targets. The Interborough Rapid Transit, and going back a little bit in time over here, the IRT line, for old-time New Yorkers, it arrived on Broadway at West 157th in 1904, and Audubon Park was ready for the explosive growth with the first new buildings constructed in 1905, just outside the Audubon Park boundary. Now, for those of you that might be familiar with, with HDFCs, you'll notice within that district over there at 800 Riverside Drive, there is a building called the Grinnell, and that's I guess as a legacy name because the Grinnell family held on to most of the former Audubon estate property and sold it to syndicate developers in 1908. But obviously, this was among the land, where the Grinnell at 800 Riverside Drive is currently located. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a grand building. It was built to be luxury. And the apartments are large and spacious and airy. Just there isn't much out there that you can compare it to. Very unique building. A year later, there were, after the syndicate of developers, bought the properties in 1908, in 1909, 9 apartment buildings were constructed and replaced the wood frame villas. So these wood frame villas were actually, quite luxurious at the time. And it was kind of like a getaway from the city. And now obviously this is, part of, the Manhattan cityscape, but, back then it was, you were out in the country. During that post IRT period and until I'd say about 1932, 19 apartment houses were constructed in the Audubon Historic District. And these buildings were marketed for upper middle class tenants. The construction, though, started and some of these things, go back a little bit. There was the Audubon Terrace complex, and many people of today know it from its multiple cultural institutions. That's where it was designed to be, and it was almost like a collection of educational and cultural museums, one right after the another. And today, it was intended to be a complex of museums. The original complex included the Church of Our Lady Esperanza and the Hispanic Society of America. At one point, and this goes to somebody with my type of background, there was the American Numismatic Society, the ANS. They also called this location home. And it's notable in my life because I was deeply involved in numismatics growing up as a child, or otherwise known as coin collecting. So, for those that are not familiar, that is, certainly, interesting. I actually had a friend that growing up, that actually interned at the ANS when they were at this location. Both he and he actually was still involved in numismatics. But the ANS had actually moved, down all the way downtown. The original institutions that were included were the Hispanic Society of America, the Church of Our Lady Esperanza, the American Numismatic Society, the American Geographic Society, the Museum of the American Indian. Today, the complex is occupied by Hispanic Society of America, still there. The American Academy Arts of Letters, that one of our agents has a relative actually going to school there. I know that much. And Boricua College as well. I'm going to be working at some future date on an episode where I tie the connection with the American Numismatic Society and Harlem resident Maya Angelou. Stay tuned for that. I think that it will be interesting to kind of connect the dots on how all these very separate items are interconnected. Now, contained within this land today over here there's also the Riverside Oval. It's located within the historic district. And, most people don't realize, just how far north that Riverside Park actually goes. And it actually goes to, this Riverside Oval. That's the northernmost section of Riverside Park. And today there's a group of volunteers, residents of the neighborhood that volunteer to maintain the oval. On the other end, on the southern end of the district is, and we've talked about this in other episodes as well, is, it's the border of Hamilton Heights and Washington Heights. Trinity Cemetery is across the street from the residential side of the historic district. And it's one of the few active burial grounds in Manhattan, with possibly just a few remaining openings. I don't quite know what what it looks like today, but I know that pre-COVID they had a few possibilities remaining. A few years had passed, so I don't know, maybe they're at capacity at this point. The cemetery, though, belongs to Trinity Church. It's, if you haven't heard this in other episodes, just to rehash quickly, the cemetery, it belongs to the same Trinity Church that has the graveyard in Lower Manhattan. That was filled to capacity in the early 19th century. That the land for the cemetery was purchased from Richard F. Carman, who now has a micro neighborhood within Hamilton Heights called Carmansville. And it was named after him, of course. Now, nobody actually knows the full boundaries of Carmansville. It seems tenuous, and but what we do know for certain is that Richard F. Carman had owned a tremendous amount of property, north of 125th Street. So that much we know for sure. But what was considered actually the neighborhood of Carmansville, that we don't have the full extent on. And I'll discuss Carmansville in a whole separate episode. But what I can offer right now is that Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, he grew up in the practicing on the court of the Carmansville Playground. And, that is better known today as the Battlegrounds. And I'm not a sports person. However, though, there's people out there that, that are familiar with the Battlegrounds, because that is one of the most competitive locations to learn to play basketball or to play basketball in the country. And, a lot of those in the NBA will, keep an eye out on the playgrounds over there. And if you're famous and want to come back home or play at the Carmansville, the Battlegrounds or the playground over there, ultimately you're expected to bring it. Just because you're in the NBA, that doesn't excuse you from, doing things light. They take it very seriously there. So, if you go, expect a great show. And if you're planning on perhaps playing and be prepared, some of the best are playing there. But, the cemetery wall was interestingly used as a line of defense drawn by the Continental Army in 1776 after the British defeated George Washington in the Battle of Harlem Heights. Now, longtime listeners might remember that we've actually done an episode on the Battle of Harlem Heights, but this particular one, a plaque can be found marking the site along the fence on Broadway. And you can always go back into our, prior episodes and listen to that episode of Harlem Heights. And it did actively involve George Washington. We'll talk about George Washington a lot in these episodes, just to give you a better sense. The cemetery itself has a lot of famous figures that are interred there, permanently resting in peace, including John Jacob Astor, famously known as dying on the Titanic. And we actually have done an episode on the Astors as well. Alfred Tennyson Dickens, son of Charles Dickens, and godson of Alfred Lloyd Tennyson. It rests there, and we talk a little bit about that in additional episodes as well. As do we talk about Clement Clarke Moore, and we give additional detail on his background. But to be short, he wrote the poem, relating to St. Nicholas. I forgot the name of it correctly, but everyone knows the poem as "'Twas the night before Christmas, not a creature was stirring, not even a mouse." Well, that was the work of Clement Clarke Moore. More recent, I guess, people that have been interred in the cemetery. Former New York City Mayor Ed Koch and former Law and Order star, and I'll always know him as Lenny Briscoe from Law and Order, but his true name is Jerry Orbach, and it's also worth noting, especially from a pop culture perspective, that scenes from the Royal Tenenbaums were shot here. Just across the street, and sort of borderline whether it's part of the historic district, for the Audubon Historic District, is the Church of the Intercession, and it's at 155th, and it's the east side of Broadway. It was completed in 1950. Its Episcopal congregation existed in the neighborhood long before the building was built. and they needed, actually, they had a couple locations nearby, and they needed to consolidate these locations. It was founded originally in 1846 and entered an agreement with Trinity Church. And Trinity Church was actually originally planning on constructing a chapel in the cemetery anyway. So, one way or the other, there was going to be a chapel. But the Tudor Revival style is connected to the church by a cloister surrounding a small courtyard. So on occasion, that cloister actually makes for great filming. So I do remember there was a Nicolas Cage movie that wasn't widely released. Can't recall the name of it. But they definitely did some filming in there with the cloister. Absolutely beautiful, location. There's also tombs beneath the church, and actually that is can be rented out as a rental space and then a place to entertain. And it's actually a pretty cool place. I know that Saturday Night Live and some bands, well-known bands, have come through that space and held after parties there, in the crypt area. So it's kind of a cool space. Go down, explore. That's I always say, I'm like, the purpose behind so many of these episodes is to kind of encourage you to go out and explore, know the history of these neighborhoods, and just pick out what interests you. But yeah, always explore the neighborhoods. But what's worth mentioning over here is that a week before Christmas, at the Church of the Intercession, they do a formal reading of the poem, A Visit from St. Nicholas, and that's the one they mentioned before, as it was written by Clement Clark Moore, who permanently resides or rests in the cemetery. There's a bunch of residential buildings in the historic district today, many of which were designed by star architects during their day of the early 1890s. The early 1900s. And some of these star architects included George F. Pelham, Neville and Baggy, Schwartz and Gross, George and Edward Blum, Emery Roth, as well as a few others. So these are all the same names that you'll hear me, talk about over and over again in the episodes. These were the star architects of the day. Some of these buildings have since been converted into condos and co-ops available for purchase. I've sold quite a number in the historic district. I think it's a great value. There's I guess the positives are, that you're getting great space for the right price, and that right price is meant for affordable living. I guess the downside though is it does feel a little bit more remote, and while the C train is not too far of a walk, the only really truly convenient subway train over there is the one. So that's kind of like the downside of that area. We'll talk much more about this in a future episode. The Morris Jumel Mansion, it's just outside the Audubon Historic District, and we'll have an entire episode on its history, along with the wooden clapboard houses on the cobblestone street called Sylvan Terrace that still stands today. And Sylvan Terrace was originally meant for the horses and and some of the servants to reside in. Today the Morris Jumel Mansion, it's a mansion with ties to General George Washington and Aaron Burr. And, that's where we just get a little interesting. Past episodes and future episodes will start connecting all these dots together, but you're going to hear a lot about Aaron Burr, George Washington, and a whole bunch of other founding fathers over and over again. But one of the last things I think that's worth mentioning right now is, due to the very nature that this was, neighborhood was named or sub-neighborhood was named after John James Audubon, the naturalist. It only makes sense that there was an art project by a gallery, no longer in the area, but But what they did is on the sides of some of the buildings and including the front of one building, bird mules were painted on the side of the building, and it was a pretty cool art project. And you can see it through the northern portion of Hamilton Heights and a little bit into the southern portion of Washington Heights. So I think that was kind of like a cool project that was undertaken, and it definitely gives it a very different, unique vibe and feel of everything. Again, thank you for joining us today, for another episode of Harlem Stories. Again, we want to encourage you to, go out there, explore these neighborhoods, have some fun with it. We're not historians, but we certainly love history, and we love bringing to you some of the more important points. And again, thank you so much, and I hope to produce some great material for you in the future. Until then, have a great day.